Hello, this is Reindeer's Bees, and today we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of single deeps versus double deeps. Which is better, 1 deep or 2 deeps for brood? Advantages for single deeps. I think the best advantage is you make way more honey. So since they're single deeps, they don't put nearly as much honey, they don't have as much honey in the brood nest. So all their honey goes in your honey supers above. So that's probably the biggest advantage. You have way less frames to look through. Are you tired of looking through 20 deep frames to find the queen or to make a split? It can be infuriating and it takes much longer a lot of times when you use double deeps. The area in a single deep is much smaller to heat for the bees, so during the winter and the early spring when they start to rear brood, this can be a big advantage. It could be the difference between them not being able to heat the brood nest and dying because they just have a smaller space to heat, so it's a lot easier for the bees to do it. Another huge advantage for single deeps is mite treatments are much more effective because the brood is confined to one box, and since it's only in one box, the mite treatment is much more effective. That's really important because, mites are the biggest threat to the honeybee in the US, far and away. It's not even close. The viruses that they inject are very dangerous. The single deeps are also much easier to move because single deeps only are, one box by nature. Therefore, it's easy to just pick up and move. Whereas a double deep, one box can fall off the other while you're moving it. It's much more challenging and much higher risk. And the last thing is, with the mite treatment, not only is it more effective, but it also costs a lot less money. For Apovar and HotGuard, they both use strips, and it's more strips per more frames. Therefore, you're using much more mite treatment when you're treating a double deep than a single deep, twice as much. So it saves you a lot of money. So the disadvantages to single deeps, they're going to swarm a lot more often. Since they're half the size, you have half as much leeway, meaning you have to be in them more often to make sure they don't swarm. And it's just, the management is more intensive in general. The biggest drawback to single deeps by far and away, at least in my opinion, is that they starve right after the honey flow. So let's say your honey flow ends, you take off every one of their honey supers, and then you come back 2 weeks later. They may have starved in that time because they probably only have about 2 frames of honey in the bottom box, and that's not enough to sustain 40,000 or 50,000 bees plus some developing. So you need to feed as soon as you take off the honey supers or leave one on. So that's really important. Another disadvantage is you need more equipment you need queen excluders. So that's a piece of equipment that you can use with double deeps and can be useful, but is not completely necessary. Whereas with single deeps, you have to use a queen excluder, otherwise they'll put brood in your supers. With a double deep, you just have a higher potential winter cluster, meaning since they have, likely 16 frames of that they can put brood on in a double deep, they have the potential to have more bees, more frames of brood, which equals more bees for winter. The bigger the winter cluster is, the better it will do, and the more access to food around it will have. Last but not least, you get less pollen in your supers. So for new beekeepers, if you get pollen in your honey supers and you live in the south or even in the north, wax moths are a huge issue, so are hive beetles. So once you harvest it and you're storing that, the wax moths and the hive beetles could destroy it if it has pollen in it. And if you have double deeps, they're going to store the vast majority of the time, they're going to store the pollen in the first or second deep and not into the first super. Whereas with the single deeps, it's not unlikely for them to store pollen in the first super. So that can be a huge issue when harvesting. There are some definite advantages to them. So hives don't swarm nearly as quickly in double deeps as they do in single deeps. They just have much more space, and if you're a week or two behind, you're much less likely to have your double swarm than your single. So that's something to keep in mind. Don't need to be fed nearly as much because they put a lot of honey in that second deep. And that second deep will get them through the dearth part of the summer often because they'll have stored, 5-6 frames of honey and have a couple frames of brood in the middle. So that's a huge advantage. And also, likewise, this can be true for the fall. If you harvest fall honey, then they're still going to have stored a lot in your double deep or in your second deep, and that way you don't have to feed that much before winter, so that's a big deal. Another massive advantage is having more frames to split from. So if you have 20 frames, there's a much better chance that you're going to find the right one to split out. You know, when you're choosing frames for splits, it's good to have a good variety, and that way it just makes it a lot easier. Advantages of double deeps. So when you're starting out as a new beekeeper, you may have 0 frames of drawn comb. So it's so important to get those frames drawn. And if you're trying to build out a double deep before winter, you're going to have to do infinitely more feeding than if you only had to draw out a single deep. So that's a big disadvantage. I would definitely not have 18 colonies going into winter if I had to draw double as much comb, because the vast majority of my hives are singles. So it's much easier to get 10 frames drawn rather than 20, so you can have more colonies to produce honey or produce bees the next year. The double deeps do make less honey than the singles, and this is for 2 reasons. Mostly they just put it in their second deep, so they put less of it in the supers. And this is my opinion personally, I think that since they have more brood, even though they may have more bees in the end because more frames of brood that they can have, they may have more bees because they have more space to put brood, but they have to take care of more brood, which also takes more work. So since they have more frames of brood, that takes away more workers from graduating into foragers and making honey during the honey flow. In a double deep, because the brood's not concentrated to one box, so it just makes it a lot more challenging to kill all the mites. So hard to find, or it can be so hard, especially for new beekeepers, to find a queen when she's could be on 20 frames possibly. It's 50% easier to do it when you only have 10 frames, so that's a huge drawback of double deeps. The second deep is often full of honey during the honey flow, and pulling off that deep can be very challenging for a lot of people because it can be about 80 pounds. So that weight is challenging to get all the way up off the hive and then down to the ground and then pick it up and put it back on again. So that's challenging about doubles. One thing that I found that people don't talk about on YouTube, but I found is really challenging, is if you have 2 deeps, the bees are much less likely to go into your super above because they already have a lot of comb drawn, so they're less likely to go above. And so I didn't get any honey supers drawn till my 4th season, so till 2021, 3 years in. So if you only have 2 deep, or if you only have 1 deep, they're much more likely to go into the first super and start, drawing out the comb. I know I'm missing some things about disadvantages for singles. I think it's because I'm biased. I prefer single deeps. 16 out of the 18 hives that were going into winter this year were single deeps. And the other 2 I'm only have them as doubles because I want to use them for making queens. So I prefer single deeps. I think it's just so much easier to manage, even though it may take more work, which makes sense because if I only have, about 20 hives, it's not a big deal for me to spend more time in the bee yard. I love looking at bees. So for commercial operation, it might make a lot more sense to use doubles because it's just less labor intense to use double deeps. And the comb drawing is also really important because my season for bees drawing comb, I can get at best 4 months for the bees to draw out comb. And so if I only have that much time and I want to grow my hives a lot, I'm going to have to feed a lot, which costs a lot of money. It also just means that I'm not able to get as many hives for winter, and I want more hives for winter because I want more bees in the next spring to make honey so I can sell queens and do all of that stuff. Make sure you subscribe. I'm going to be making more educational videos just like this. Hit that bell to be notified when I upload. Comment down below. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Reindeers Bees, and I'll see you in the next one.